Why avoidants avoid making time to see you. Imagine this for a moment. Someone can go hours without replying, days without making plans, weeks without seeing you, and yet somehow they still linger in your mind more than the people who show up consistently. It doesn't make logical sense, but emotions rarely follow logic. What makes it even more confusing is that this person doesn't seem completely gone. They haven't disappeared. They haven't clearly ended things. They still send messages. They still react to your stories. They still occasionally remind you that they care, and that's exactly what creates the confusion. If they care, why don't they make time to see you? Why does every attempt to spend meaningful time together feel like trying to catch smoke with your bare hands? Why do plans stay vague, conversations stay distant, and opportunities to connect somehow keep slipping through the cracks? If you've ever found yourself staring at your phone wondering why someone who claims to value you never seems available for you, then stay with me because what you're about to hear may completely change the way you understand avoidant behavior. And while you're here, if attachment psychology, relationship dynamics, and the hidden reasons people act the way they do fascinate you, hit subscribe. That way you'll never miss these deep dives into the emotional patterns most people never learn to recognize until they're already trapped inside them. One of the biggest misconceptions people have about avoidance is believing that time is just time. For most people, spending an afternoon together, grabbing coffee, going for a walk, or simply sitting in the same room feels ordinary. But for someone with strong avoidant tendencies, time together often means something much deeper. Time creates intimacy. Intimacy creates emotional exposure, and emotional exposure activates fears they have spent years learning to avoid. This is why what looks like a simple invitation from your perspective may feel entirely different from theirs. When you ask to see them, they are not only thinking about the meeting itself, their nervous system may already be anticipating emotional closeness, expectations, vulnerability, dependency, and all the uncomfortable feelings that come with being truly known. To them, spending time together isn't always just about sharing an experience. Sometimes it feels like moving one step closer to a level of connection that secretly terrifies them. The closer someone gets, the harder it becomes to maintain emotional distance, and for an avoidant, emotional distance often feels like safety. This doesn't mean they consciously decide to avoid you. In many cases, the reaction happens automatically. They simply feel an urge to postpone, delay, stay busy, or keep things from becoming too frequent. What you're witnessing isn't always rejection. Sometimes it's self-protection disguised as scheduling problems. This leads to another painful truth that many people struggle to understand. Avoidance can genuinely want you while simultaneously avoiding seeing you. To someone with a secure attachment style, this sounds contradictory. How can you miss someone and avoid them at the same time? How can you care deeply but never seem available? Yet this contradiction sits at the very heart of avoidant behavior. Missing someone from a distance feels safe. Thinking about someone allows complete control. Fantasizing about connection requires no vulnerability. Reality is different. Reality demands presence. Reality asks them to engage emotionally in real time. Reality introduces uncertainty. The version of you that exists in their mind can be approached safely whenever they choose. The real version of you standing in front of them has needs, emotions, expectations, and the power to affect them deeply, and that's where the discomfort begins. This is why an avoidant may think about you constantly, feel attached to you, even care about losing you, while still failing to make consistent efforts to see you. Their feelings may be real, but their fears are real too. The problem isn't always the absence of desire. Often it's the conflict between desire and fear. One side pulls them toward connection, the other side pulls them toward distance. And distance usually wins because distance feels familiar. The strange thing is that many people assume avoidants are afraid of relationships themselves. In reality, they're often afraid of what relationships require. Relationships require emotional availability. They require consistency. They require allowing another person to matter. And once another person matters, there is always the possibility of disappointment, loss, dependence, or heartbreak. Those possibilities can feel overwhelming to someone who has spent years convincing themselves that independence is the safest way to live. That's why they may seem enthusiastic one day and unavailable the next. Their emotions are not always moving in a straight line. They experience connection, then fear follows. They experience closeness, then a need for space appears. They feel drawn toward someone, then suddenly become aware of how vulnerable that attraction makes them feel. To an outside observer, the behavior looks inconsistent. Internally, however, it often feels like a constant battle between competing needs: the need to connect, the need to protect themselves, the need to belong, the need to stay free. And because those needs are pulling in opposite directions, making time for someone can begin to feel surprisingly complicated. What makes this even more confusing is that many avoidants don't consciously recognize what's happening. They don't wake up in the morning thinking, "I'm going to avoid this person today." Instead, they feel subtle discomfort that they struggle to identify. They suddenly become interested in work projects. They focus on personal goals. They convince themselves they need more time alone. They tell themselves they'll make plans next week. Then next week becomes another week and another. Meanwhile, the person waiting for them starts questioning everything. Am I asking for too much? Did I do something wrong? Are they losing interest? The heartbreaking reality is that the answer isn't always straightforward. Sometimes they are interested, sometimes they are scared, sometimes they're both. And when fear and attraction collide inside an avoidant person, one of the first things to disappear is consistent effort towards spending time together. Because every meeting carries the possibility of deeper attachment, and deeper attachment is exactly what their protective instincts have spent years trying to keep at arm's length. The result is a cycle that leaves both people frustrated. One person keeps wondering why they never seem to have enough time. The other keeps wondering why making time feels so difficult. And until you understand the psychology underneath the behavior, it can feel like a mystery with no answer at all. And this is where another layer of the puzzle begins to reveal itself. Because if you've ever felt like an avoidant person always has something else going on, you're not imagining it. There always seems to be a project, a responsibility, a family obligation, a work deadline, a hobby, an errand, or some unexpected situation that suddenly requires their attention. From the outside, it can look like they're choosing everything else over you. Sometimes that interpretation feels impossible to avoid because the pattern becomes so consistent. But what many people fail to realize is that busyness often serves a psychological purpose. It creates a socially acceptable form of distance. Saying "I'm busy" feels much easier than saying "being emotionally close right now makes me uncomfortable." One explanation sounds reasonable and practical. The other requires vulnerability and self-awareness. So the avoidant nervous system naturally gravitates toward the safer option. The tragedy is that they may not even be consciously aware they're doing it. They genuinely believe their schedule is the problem. They genuinely convince themselves they'll make more time once things calm down. Yet somehow things never fully calm down. There is always another reason to delay, another task to prioritize, another distraction to focus on, and because busyness is rewarded by society, it rarely gets questioned. People praise productivity, people admire independence, people respect ambition. Very few people recognize that endless busyness can sometimes become a sophisticated form of emotional escape. For the avoidant person, staying occupied protects them from sitting still long enough to feel the intensity of connection. Every hour filled with activity becomes an hour where vulnerability can be postponed. What makes this dynamic even more difficult is that the pressure they experience often has very little to do with what you're actually asking from them. You may simply want dinner together. You may simply want a conversation, a walk, a few hours of quality time. But inside the mind of an avoidant, that request can quietly transform into something much larger. A simple meeting becomes a symbol. They begin imagining future expectations. They wonder whether spending more time together means the relationship is becoming more serious. They worry about disappointing you. They worry about being responsible for your feelings. They worry about losing personal freedom. They worry about not being enough. The strange thing is that many of these fears never get spoken aloud. They happen silently beneath the surface while the other person remains completely unaware. That's why their reactions can seem disproportionate. You ask for something small, yet they respond as though you've asked for something enormous. It isn't because your request is unreasonable. It's because they aren't reacting solely to the present moment. They're reacting to everything they believe the present moment might eventually lead to. Their mind starts racing several chapters ahead while you're still focused on the page directly in front of you. As a result, spending time together can begin to feel emotionally loaded. Every interaction feels connected to larger fears they may not even fully understand themselves. This is also why texting often becomes the preferred form of connection. If you've ever wondered why someone can message you consistently but struggle to meet in person, the answer lies in the difference between controlled connection and real-time intimacy. Texting creates distance. It allows them to choose when to engage, how much to reveal, and when to pull back. If emotions become overwhelming, they can pause. If vulnerability starts creeping in, they can disappear for a while. If they need space, they can create it instantly. Face-to-face interaction doesn't offer those same protections. When you're physically present, emotions become harder to manage from a distance. Silence means something. Eye contact means something. Physical presence creates a level of emotional immediacy that cannot be edited, delayed, or carefully controlled. This is why an avoidant may appear warm, thoughtful, and emotionally available through messages only to become elusive when it comes to actual plans. It isn't necessarily because the feelings aren't real. Sometimes the feelings are exactly why the in-person connection feels so intimidating. Texting allows them to experience pieces of connection while maintaining enough emotional distance to feel safe. Meeting in person removes many of those protective barriers, and suddenly the vulnerability becomes much harder to avoid. Perhaps the most confusing reality of all is that stronger feelings don't always create stronger pursuit in avoidant individuals. In fact, the opposite can happen. The more someone matters, the more their fears become activated. This is one of the most misunderstood aspects of avoidant attachment because it completely contradicts what most people expect. We assume attraction should lead to closeness. We assume deeper feelings should create greater effort. Yet for an avoidant, powerful emotions can sometimes trigger retreat. Not because they don't care, but because caring raises the emotional stakes. When someone starts becoming important, the possibility of loss becomes real. The possibility of dependence becomes real. The possibility of heartbreak becomes real. Suddenly, what once felt casual begins to feel significant, and significance creates vulnerability. That's why some avoidants seem surprisingly comfortable in the early stages when everything feels light and low pressure, only to become distant once genuine emotional attachment begins developing. The closer they feel, the more exposed they feel. The more exposed they feel, the stronger their urge to create space. To the person on the receiving end, this can feel deeply personal. It can feel like affection is disappearing, but in many cases the feelings haven't disappeared at all. What has increased is the fear surrounding those feelings. Behind all of this exists an internal battle that rarely gets discussed openly. One part of them wants exactly what everyone else wants. They want connection, they want understanding, they want companionship, they want someone who sees them, values them, and stays. But another part of them has spent years building emotional walls designed to prevent pain. These two sides often exist simultaneously, creating a constant push and pull dynamic that leaves both people exhausted. One day they move closer because loneliness feels stronger than fear. The next day they pull away because fear feels stronger than loneliness. One moment they imagine a future with someone. The next moment they feel trapped by the very idea of that future. This emotional tug-of-war creates inconsistency that confuses everyone involved, including the avoidant themselves. They may genuinely intend to make more time. They may sincerely want to be present. But when the moment arrives, the protective side of their nervous system steps in and begins whispering familiar warnings. Slow down, create distance, stay independent, don't get too attached, don't let someone matter too much. And because those messages have often been reinforced for years, they carry enormous influence. What you're witnessing when an avoidant struggles to make time isn't always a lack of caring. Sometimes it's the visible result of an invisible conflict that has been unfolding inside them long before you ever entered their life. And understanding that conflict is the key to understanding why connection feels so difficult for someone who may secretly want it just as much as anyone else. And if you've ever experienced the frustration of having plans suddenly disappear at the last minute, this next part may finally explain something that has haunted you for a long time. Because one of the most painful patterns associated with avoidant behavior is not simply avoiding plans altogether. It's agreeing to plans and then pulling away when those plans become real. At first, everything seems fine. They say yes, they sound interested, they may even appear excited. But then something changes as the day approaches. The closer the meeting gets, the more emotionally immediate it becomes. What once existed as an abstract future event is now becoming a reality, and with that reality comes a rising sense of internal pressure. This is where anticipatory anxiety often enters the picture. The avoidant mind begins running through possibilities. What if the interaction becomes too emotionally intense? What if expectations increase afterward? What if they disappoint you? What if they feel trapped? What if the connection deepens in ways they aren't prepared to handle? None of this may happen consciously, yet the emotional weight continues building beneath the surface. By the time the meeting is only hours away, that discomfort can become stronger than their desire to connect. Suddenly a cancellation appears, an excuse emerges, a reason materializes. To the person waiting on the other side, it feels devastating because the rejection feels personal, but often the avoidant isn't running from the person. They're running from the emotional activation the meeting creates inside themselves. Unfortunately, the outcome feels exactly the same. You still experience disappointment. You still feel unimportant. You still wonder why making time for you seems so difficult. And that emotional wound can deepen every time the pattern repeats. At the heart of this behavior lies something that many avoidants hold very close to their identity: independence. For most people, independence is a healthy quality. It allows individuals to stand on their own feet, pursue goals, and maintain a sense of self. But for someone with strong avoidant tendencies, independence often becomes more than a quality. It becomes a survival strategy. Somewhere along the way, they learned that relying on others could be risky. They learned that vulnerability could lead to disappointment. They learned that needing someone created exposure. As a result, self-sufficiency became emotionally sacred. The ability to handle everything alone became a source of safety. This is why relationships can create such internal conflict. Relationships naturally involve mutual reliance. They involve emotional investment. They involve allowing another person to matter. But every step toward deeper connection can feel like a step away from the independence that has protected them for so long. What many partners interpret as emotional coldness is often a fierce attachment to self-reliance. The avoidant isn't always choosing isolation because they prefer it. Sometimes they choose it because it feels familiar. Familiarity creates comfort, even when that comfort comes at the expense of connection. Spending time alone allows them to remain fully in control of their emotional environment. No expectations, no obligations, no uncertainty, just space. And when emotional stress increases, that space becomes even more appealing. To truly understand why making time can feel so threatening, however, we have to look much deeper than adulthood. Most avoidant patterns did not suddenly appear when someone entered a relationship. They often began years earlier, during moments that shaped how connection itself was understood. Imagine growing up in an environment where emotional needs were ignored, minimized, criticized, or simply misunderstood. Imagine learning that expressing vulnerability didn't bring comfort. Imagine discovering that relying on others led to disappointment. Over time, a powerful lesson begins to form. If emotional needs create pain, then suppressing those needs feels safer. The child adapts. The child learns to self-soothe. The child becomes independent before they are emotionally ready to do so. Eventually, those adaptations become personality traits. Years later, the adult may appear strong, capable, and emotionally self-contained, yet beneath that exterior is someone who learned long ago that closeness comes with risk. This doesn't mean every avoidant person experienced dramatic trauma. Sometimes the wounds are subtle. Sometimes they emerge from repeated emotional misunderstandings rather than obvious harm, but the result can be remarkably similar. The nervous system begins associating intimacy with discomfort. The closer someone gets, the more those old protective mechanisms quietly activate. And because these patterns were formed so early, they often operate automatically. The person isn't necessarily making a conscious decision to create distance. Their nervous system learned distance long before their adult relationships ever began. This is why many avoidants genuinely struggle to understand their own behavior. From the outside, it can seem obvious. They keep pulling away. They keep creating space. They keep postponing connection. Yet internally, they may experience something completely different. They may tell themselves they simply need more time. They may believe they are focusing on priorities. They may convince themselves that things will improve once life becomes less stressful. The problem is that the deeper emotional pattern remains invisible to them. Because avoidance often operates beneath conscious awareness, they rarely wake up and think, "I am distancing myself because intimacy makes me uncomfortable." Instead, the behavior disguises itself as practicality, logic, or circumstance. That's what makes it so difficult to change. You cannot easily solve a problem you don't fully recognize. This is why some avoidants repeat the same relationship patterns for years without understanding why the same conflicts continue appearing. They don't see the invisible thread connecting everything together. They only see individual situations, individual misunderstandings, individual relationships. Meanwhile, the underlying fear remains untouched. And because it remains untouched, it continues influencing decisions about time, closeness, and emotional availability in ways they don't fully understand. For the person on the receiving end, this creates an incredibly dangerous trap. The more inconsistent the avoidant becomes, the more tempting it can feel to chase reassurance. You start thinking that if you just explain yourself better, love harder, become more patient, or prove your value more clearly, things will finally change. Every cancellation feels like a challenge to overcome. Every withdrawal feels like a puzzle to solve. Every moment of distance feels like an invitation to try harder. But this is where so many people unknowingly become trapped inside the cycle. because increased pursuit often creates increased pressure, and increased pressure tends to activate even more avoidance. The more one person moves forward, the more the other feels compelled to step back. Neither person necessarily wants this dynamic, yet both become participants in it. The pursuer becomes increasingly focused on restoring closeness. The avoidant becomes increasingly focused on restoring space. And before long, the relationship begins revolving around those opposing goals rather than genuine connection. This doesn't mean reaching out is wrong, it doesn't mean expressing needs is unhealthy, but it does mean that chasing someone into emotional availability rarely works. Emotional availability cannot be forced into existence, it has to come from within, and until that happens, every attempt to close the distance may simply create more of it. Which brings us to one of the most important questions of all. When an avoidant doesn't make time for you, what does that behavior actually mean? Because the answer is more complicated and more revealing than most people realize. The answer begins with accepting something that most people resist for far too long. A lack of time does not always mean a lack of feelings, but it also does not automatically prove the presence of them. This is where so many people get lost. They hear explanations about avoidant attachment and immediately assume every act of distance is evidence of hidden love. They convince themselves that every cancellation is fear, every delay is anxiety, every absence is emotional overwhelm. But reality is more nuanced than that. Sometimes an avoidant struggles to make time because intimacy genuinely scares them. Sometimes they are fighting an internal battle they don't know how to win. Sometimes they care deeply and still fail to show up consistently. Yet there are other situations where the explanation is much simpler. Sometimes the person is emotionally unavailable. Sometimes they are unwilling to invest. Sometimes they enjoy the connection without wanting the responsibility that comes with it. And sometimes, difficult as it may be to hear, the level of interest simply doesn't match the level of hope being placed upon it. This is why behavior matters so much. Feelings hidden inside someone's mind can never build a relationship on their own. Intentions that never become actions cannot create security. Understanding avoidance psychology is valuable because it creates clarity, but clarity should never become an excuse to ignore reality. The question isn't only whether someone cares. The question is whether they are making meaningful efforts to participate in the connection despite their fears. Because fear may explain behavior, but it does not erase its impact. This is where many people overlook the small signs that reveal the difference between someone who cares but struggles and someone who simply keeps you at a distance. An avoidant who genuinely values the connection often leaves breadcrumbs of effort, even when consistency is difficult. They may check in unexpectedly, they may remember details that matter to you, they may reach out after periods of withdrawal, they may attempt connection in ways that feel imperfect yet sincere. Their efforts may not always arrive in the form you want, but there is usually evidence that the relationship continues occupying space in their mind. There is movement, there is investment, there is an ongoing pull toward connection, even if it exists alongside fear. The important thing is that the effort remains visible over time. Not perfect effort, not constant effort, just real effort, because people who care typically find some way to demonstrate it even when emotional challenges exist. Their actions may be inconsistent, but they are not entirely absent. There are moments where you can see them trying to bridge the gap between what they feel and what they fear, and those moments matter because they reveal that avoidance is not the only force operating within them. Connection is still fighting for space too. But there is another side to this conversation that deserves equal attention. Sometimes the signs point in a very different direction. Sometimes the excuses never stop, the delays never end, the promises never become reality, the future remains permanently postponed, weeks turn into months, months turn into years. Every conversation about spending more time together somehow circles back to the same unresolved place. Nothing progresses, nothing changes, nothing moves forward. This is when it becomes essential to separate potential from reality. Potential is seductive because it allows us to imagine who someone could become. Reality asks us to look at who they are right now. Potential tells us to wait a little longer. Reality asks how long we've already been waiting. Potential whispers stories about what might happen someday. Reality points toward what keeps happening repeatedly. And while hope can be beautiful, hope becomes dangerous when it keeps us emotionally invested in a future that never arrives. One of the hardest lessons in relationships is realizing that understanding someone's wounds does not obligate you to remain wounded by their behavior. Compassion and self-respect must exist together. You can understand why someone struggles to make time for you while also recognizing that the struggle is costing you something. You can empathize with their fears while still acknowledging your own needs. Those two truths are not enemies. They can exist side by side. And yet, despite everything we've discussed, something remarkable can happen when an avoidant person genuinely begins to feel safe. Safety changes people in ways pressure never can. Pressure creates resistance. Safety creates openness. When someone no longer feels judged, trapped, controlled, or emotionally overwhelmed, the defensive walls that once seemed permanent can begin to lower. Not overnight, not magically, not perfectly, but gradually. The person who once disappeared for days may start showing up more consistently. The person who once avoided making plans may begin initiating them. The person who once felt threatened by closeness may start discovering that closeness does not automatically lead to pain. This transformation doesn't happen because someone was chased hard enough or loved intensely enough. It happens because the avoidant individual becomes willing to confront the fears beneath their behavior. They begin recognizing the difference between genuine danger and old emotional conditioning. They learn that connection and independence do not have to be enemies. They discover that allowing someone to matter does not mean losing themselves. And perhaps most importantly, they learn that vulnerability, while uncomfortable, is not always something that must be escaped. Growth becomes possible when fear is acknowledged rather than obeyed. That's when making time starts feeling less like a threat and more like a choice. And ultimately, this brings us to the deepest truth hidden inside the title of this video. Time is never just time. Time is attention. Time is energy. Time is presence. Time is one of the clearest ways human beings communicate value. When someone consistently makes room for you in their life, they are offering something they can never get back. And when someone consistently avoids making room for you, the reasons deserve careful examination. Sometimes those reasons are rooted in attachment wounds. Sometimes they are rooted in fear. Sometimes they are rooted in emotional limitations the person has not yet overcome. But regardless of the explanation, your worth remains unchanged. This is the part many people forget while trying to understand avoidance. They become so focused on decoding another person's behavior that they stop listening to their own experience. They start measuring their value by someone else's availability. They start questioning whether they are lovable enough, interesting enough, patient enough, or understanding enough. But another person's difficulty with closeness is not a measurement of your value. It never was. The real goal is not simply to understand why avoidants avoid making time to see you. The real goal is to understand it without losing sight of yourself. Because healthy love is not built solely on understanding someone's fears. It is built on mutual effort, mutual presence, and mutual willingness to show up. And at the end of the day, no explanation, no matter how psychologically fascinating, can replace the feeling of being genuinely chosen by someone who makes time for you because they want to, not because they have to.